Hey everyone, welcome to the Tech Seeking Human podcast, and this time I'm joined by a couple of old friends. One of these old friends, Paul, we go a long way back.
Way back.
Way back, like Perth back.
33 years back.
Oh, why did you have to do that?
Come on.
33 years? Has it really been that long? Ellie, are you even 33 yet?
This year.
This year. So we go back. This is an awesome way to start a podcast. We go back longer than Ellie's been alive. This is awesome. Ellie, welcome to the Tech Seeking Human podcast as a new host of the show. You must be thrilled to be here.
I am. I'm feeling super young, which is so lovely, given I
You're
feel so
welcome.
old at the moment. No, it's super cool to be here, and I'm really excited to kind of unpack all the kind of cool topics that are out there. And I'm really keen to start with Paul.
I won't go all the way back to the Perth days, probably to the deep dark history, but I'll talk about really just some kind of formative stuff that happened kind of over the course of my life that kind of led to kind of where I am today. So, lucky growing up in Perth, in a family actually who had a really strong orientation around technology, which was pretty cool. My parents, similar to Dave's family, had a family business. We actually had the last full service gas station in Perth, going way back in the day. But they invested really heavily in technology. They would, put in computerized point of sale system and a bunch of other stuff at a pretty early time in their business. And, we had a computer at a pretty young age and things like that. So I started off on this journey pretty early around technology, which was, I didn't realize it until later, was like a very formative thing. Like started coding my own computer games at, 11 and 12 years old, from books and manuals and things like that, when that was the thing that was done. And just like that, it piqued a lot of interest in technology. Fast forward a bunch of years, was in uni in Perth, and I was at this school called Murdoch University, and met and got to study with some really amazing, really interesting people, a lot of which who were actually originally from Singapore, which is, I know where you're based. But one of the people that was really formative in that whole kind of journey was this guy, Dr. Dwayne Varan. He had an advanced program around marketing and the media that I got introduced to in my third year of uni, and got to explore a lot of different technology at that point, and that really kicked off this kind of even deeper journey into technology, into software as a service, payments, a whole ton of other stuff. But that was a really formative time that kind of really triggered a very, very deep interest in technology. And I was, at 19 and 20, was reading up on, books like Crossing the Chasm and understanding things like Moore's Law and a bunch of other stuff, which was probably not a very regular thing that most university students were doing in Perth at the time. And that really then kind of just kicked off a technology career that's now spanned the last 20-something years.
Why? I had no idea you gamed. You were building games and things. I knew you. Look, we used to play hockey together, and I knew your parents had a business, and I share the same. My dad was really into technology, and what was your first computer actually?
It was the original Apple II.
Yeah, see, me too. I had a feeling. I had a 2C. I think it was a 2C. It was supposed to be compatible. It looked like a pizza box with a square on top of it.
Yeah, yep, with the old black and green screen, that whole thing. Absolutely. And I remember I sent away for a bunch of magazines and whatever else where I could code my own.
Is that it?
Ellie's had to look it up.
Yeah.
Let's see what we're talking about. It did look like a pizza.
Real?
No, that's an actual computer, and it came with a floppy disk. And which computers do? You remember floppy disks, right, Ellie?
Yeah, I do remember floppy disks. Yeah.
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 Do you know how they? No. So yeah, you could genuinely use the excuse back then that the computer crashed and I lost my entire assignment, which happened to me on numerous occasions. Because even on an Apple, I had to type in run catalog to start the computer. And then when the Encyclopedia Britannica Compton's Multimedia Encyclopedia, bringing you the world on a disc. And it was the encyclopedia on a CD-ROM. It was like mind-blowing for us kids from Perth.
So the first computer you had to code to enter? So you had to understand that you were coding to enter?
Well, you had to use command line for some stuff. You essentially had shortcuts and codes to kind of trigger certain events on the computer. But it would run. It actually had its own operating system and stuff like that, with a bunch of very, very basic. I call them apps, but they certainly were. They're no comparison, right, to the apps that we understand and know today. But there was still an underlying code structure to that computer that you could either use applications for, or the stuff that I was doing in my case. Like, I literally was like writing my own asteroid game or a tank game and stuff like that, because I don't know, to me at the time it was super interesting.
And then, so if you always, because then at some point, I'm sure my dad said to me, oh, I saw Paul, he was doing something with mobile point of sale, or mobile, like in a restaurant scenario, mobile payment things or something. Were you doing something to do with that?
Yeah. So, fast forward a couple more years, I graduate from Murdoch. I went and did a role, which was actually also really interesting. I worked for this technology due diligence firm that essentially did all the research for venture capital companies. It was a small boutique firm in Perth, which got me even deeper into technology. But then what kind of I then jumped to is a point of sale company, as you point out, Dave. And so they're a Perth-based company, and they specialized in mobile POS for restaurants. And Ellie, this will be another thing that you probably don't remember, but this company was called Palm Tech, and it was called Palm Tech because it was based on the Palm Pilot, right? But what was really interesting about these guys, right, is that they built this pretty cool technology on the Palm. But the big thing about it, right, is that back then, again, when I was doing things when chisel and stone was still technology products, Wi-Fi didn't exist. So we built our own radio frequency wireless network technology that this Palm would sit in, so it would actually send the data from a handheld device back into the printer in the kitchen. So like we literally built a fully turnkey point of sale solution for restaurants and hospitality. And what was crazy about that, I joined that company in, I don't know, 2003 or something along those lines. And it wasn't that long after that that we were actually integrating a credit card payment on that handheld device. And this was like 2005. All built on Palm Pilots, all built on radio frequency. But yeah, I was doing that. I was with that company for about 5.5, nearly 6 years.
And is that the start of your whole working in fintech? Like, that's a disruptive fintech there. Is this where it starts? Like, do you have staff that you now work with and you go, well, let me give you a little bit of a history lesson of how I started out?
Yeah, it's funny. So I still do the onboarding every 2 weeks for every single new employee that starts at Plaid, which is cool. It's an amazing way to really continue to kind of stay connected with the team. And I've told that story a couple of times, and at least I got a nodding head out of Ellie about what a Palm Pilot was. I've certainly had a lot of people legitimately ask me what a Palm Pilot actually
she Googled it.
I'm pretty sure I know it from like older movies.
Thanks.
Which were on VHS.
Most likely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, look, in a lot of cases, so this company was called Palm Tech then. It's called Trinitech or something like that now, because Palm weren't very happy with us using their name. But that was totally the first entry into kind of payments and things like that, which you definitely, if you go back in time, you would definitely call that company a fintech. At the time, we didn't feel very fintechy. But that actually kind of it forced me to understand some things that I really didn't understand, right? Which was cool. Like before, what I've been used to is like, okay, cool, this credit card gets swiped through a terminal, right? And it was done. Okay, cool. We're now building the terminal, right? And what has to happen with that? And more importantly, like when you collect all of that data off the magnetic strip on the card, what are you doing with it, and where are you going with that, and who are you sending it to, and more importantly, especially because like that actually has data that bad nefarious people could use, right? Is like how are you encrypting that data, how are you managing that data at rest, at transit, and it actually got me into a world of financial services and fintech that I have to admit I never planned on being in, but I ended up in, and again it was one of those things where it was so interesting that I just wanted to kind of dive deeper and further into that world, and it was a cool company to kind of get a start in from that perspective.
And then before you got to Plaid, you spent a long time at Visa?
I did.
Had to be that or MasterCard. I was like, geez, come on, Dave.
Yeah,
it's one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and what was interesting, so I was at the point of sale company, went to Salesforce for a bunch of years, and then ended up at Visa, and really went there because I kind of couldn't get away from the urge and the interest to be back in financial services. I was watching really from the sidelines at Salesforce for a number of years, a lot of innovation that was starting to happen in financial services. And I'm a big fan of like, look, go to the place that is like the center of that thing. And Visa very much, like you think about, what Visa does. And by the way, I didn't actually know enough about Visa, honestly, when I first started to really understand what it is that they do as a company. I certainly understood, they put, there's a co-branded card in people's wallets and things like that. But when you really start to understand that as a company, sort of the infrastructure that they've built and the network that they've laid out on a global scale, it was really eye-opening to kind of be really at a company at the very center of financial services, and it was super, super interesting to kind of get a completely different view, completely different lens on the concept of a credit card transaction that I had a very nascent view of from that point of sale company, close to a decade before.
It's so interesting you talked about the infrastructure then, because I'd never thought about it this way, because now you're working for a disruptive fintech that I understand you can go into the details of how it works, because I understand there would be infrastructure behind it. But you think of disruptive technologies like, earlier today I was talking about like, Telstra, and where we all kind of grew up, Ellie originally from Australia, from Sydney. And you talk about, they're never going to get displaced because they own the infrastructure, they own the landlines, they own the broadband network or whatever. And then, of course, you fast forward and all of a sudden that's not as important as it needs to be in order to sustain a business. And so these traditional companies like a Visa have to keep innovating. And it's just very interesting, the window of opportunity that comes about with new disruptive technologies that come out. At this point, do you want to add to that, or do you want to go into like, and this is how Plaid works? And I keep thinking it's Plaid, by the way, too. But anyway,
I'm glad that
we had a whole debate.
Yeah,
I
don't know when's the right time to do this. Is it now? Because it looks like Plaid to me.
Can I have a guess? Can I have a guess at why it's Plaid? Because Dave and I have had this conversation. So Plaid to me is fabric, or like a particular type of what do you call them? Like the Scottish look
tartan.
of the tartan. Thank you. So after reading about your company, my thoughts were that fabric in essence is kind of like a woven type of fabric, and kind of it connects across two different sections. And so when I was trying to understand what Plaid was, that was how I took it. It was the kind of connector between yourself and a bank or people and banks, and that's kind of where Plaid came from. Do I get a gold star? Am I correct?
So for anyone who's just listening to the audio version of this right now, Paul is sitting there smiling like Ellie's just gone through orientation and got 100% correct. And they're both like, and they obviously shared notes before. Before Paul answers the question, the reason why I think it's Plaid is because people need to get paid, right? So if we're playing the game of like, she thinks it's a fabric and interconnected and that sounds all lovey-dovey, I think, got to get paid, not mean. Got to get myself paid, so I got to use Plaid. What do you reckon?
You can see why he needed me on this podcast, can't you?
Which is the correct answer?
He 100% needed you. Neither are correct.
Yes!
No.
And the reason why I was like grinning like a Cheshire cat is because Ellie's presumption about where the name came from is the assumption that every single person actually makes about the origin of the name of the company.
Damn it, I'm like everybody else. Okay.
But it's fun and it's funny because it comes up so many times. But so the true story behind the name of the company actually goes all the way back to the two co-founders, Zach Perret and William Hockey. They were actually out with like this is the true kind of Silicon Valley story, right? Which is like what they call the pivot story. You start one direction and you kind of change to a different product or a different solution. It's not the Friends pivot version. This is the technology pivot version.
Great episode.
But what it was, so Zach and William were building a bunch of consumer-related apps to begin with, because I thought that was the thing that they were going to often do. A lot of the consumer apps that you see today, they were trying to build something that was similar to that. And what they actually ended up finding when they were building their app is that the underlying data that they could get access to, it was very difficult to get that data. The quality wasn't that good. The connectivity to it wasn't that good. There was just problems in getting accessibility to that data. So they ended up actually writing their own bank integration to actually get the data out of a financial institution. So they actually they built the thing that now Plaid is to try and demonstrate the app that they were trying to then go get funding for. And what a lot of people kind of told them was, number one, the app that you're building isn't that great, but the infrastructure thing that you built is really good and we will totally pay money for that. But to get back to the kind of like, where did the Plaid piece come from? Well, what they did finally when they were able to get the data out of one of these financial institutions is that they geoplotted the data for all of their transactions. And they were both based in New York at the time, so it was a kind of nice tight metro area that they were working with. And the pattern actually kind of created a Plaid-like pattern overlaid onto a geomap. And that is actually where the name originates from.
I like mine better. Can you just start with a different one? Hey, are you allowed to do that? You start a company by going into the banking infrastructure? That sounds to me like it's
like a hack?
I've heard stories of some people starting companies accidentally and they did things that they weren't allowed to. And they did things, but I'm assuming this was legal. This is when the banking systems had to open up APIs and become, a little more decentralized. Is that the case?
Well, there'd always been some banking infrastructure players who were accessing data through, kind of some of the more, let's call it the traditional method of data access, which was this thing called screen scraping. But for them, they were accessing their own personal data at that point. So from that standpoint, they were really kind of mapping their own transactions from that perspective. So I wouldn't kind of put it into the bad category. I put it into the they wanted to kind of build something to try and demonstrate something else. But the outcome was a completely different company and a bunch of different solutions, which is actually pretty cool.
So can I ask, I am definitely the human in the tech-seeking human part of this, because the screen scraping and the API and blah, 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 blah. What I'm interested about is, obviously, banks are incredibly protective about their data, and obviously as a consumer, you would like to think that your bank is very protective of your data. When you say they build the infrastructure to extract that data, what does that actually mean? Awesome
question. So the short and the sweet of it is we have built this technology that allows a consumer to say, hey, I've got some banking data in this location, and that could be my account number and what they call a routing number here in the US, or I want the transactions that I've recently put through my credit card or my debit card. I want that data to show up somewhere else because there's an application that I want to use that I would get value from. And so what it essentially means is that we've built the technology on which a consumer can say, hey, I want to permission access for my data into this different app so I can then go and use that app. There's a ton of different examples in terms of the use cases and things like that, but to talk to a couple of them, number one is there's a lot of folk who kind of get into, say, something like crypto investing, right? I want to go buy a Bitcoin, I want to buy a Dogecoin, like whatever the coin is of your choice, etc. And you'll say, well, hey, look, I've got $100 in my bank account, and I want to get 100 of my dollars from that bank account over in to something, an app like Coinbase or Webull or Robinhood or something like that. And like, if you think about like the way that you used to have to do that, it was a very protracted process. You would literally have to go through and do a thing like a wire transfer or a bank transfer, something that might take a long period of time. And so what we are essentially is that we're the data layer, the infrastructure layer that allows someone to take their data and in some cases their own funds from point A to point B so that they can use an app.
So I'm so glad you eventually got to like Robinhood and a few others, because when you went Bitcoin and crypto, I went, oh my God, I'm going to need another explanation for now what you're talking about. But I get it. It's fast transfer of the funds from one to multiple other accounts, whatever it is that you're transferring, but also you provide a high layer of visibility into who has access, why they have access, and where it's going.
Exactly. And that I think one of the most important parts in all of that, right, is that it's the consumer themselves saying, hey, there's something that I have that is in this location and I just want it in another place. And you know, we've always been really proud, right, that we're a consumer permission data platform. Like it literally is the person who is saying, hey, I've got this thing that I want over there. And it's been amazing to see, right, being here for, you know, the last 15, 16 years, and particularly like the last 5, like at Plaid, like seeing the innovation that is happening now that people have got portability of that data. It's a pretty impressive place to be.
Hey, you know the saying, cut out the middleman?
Heard it.
Why wouldn't the bank or someone just go, don't need it, go and do it ourselves? It's a leading question, but you know what I mean, right? Like every one of these opportunities opens up an opportunity for disruptive technologies, but then when's the 100%. Lifespan? How do you, yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it's one of those things where, and by the way, like that, it's the build versus buy thing, and I think probably nearly every company or every technology, right, has to think about answering that question either once or multiple times, right, throughout the company's history. And similar to that kind of vein of thinking, it's like, hey, look, what are the banks good at, right? And are the banks good at providing data infrastructure services, or are they really good at providing banking services, home loan origination, mortgage origination as well, like auto, like all of these other things that are kind of core to their business? And you might argue that sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, but that's also like the thing that also spurs on innovation, right? And again, like what companies come to rely on us for is, hey, look, we know that Plaid is this trusted partner. They can get accessibility to data, and more than likely, like we can do pretty unique things with that data as well to kind of make the usage of that data, even more applicable in someone's app or in the use case that they're working on. And the trade-off becomes like, can we do this ourselves, or can we outsource that to someone who is infinitely more specialized in the things that we do? And we've got 7,000 plus customers today that have said, hey, we are totally willing to kind of outsource all of the complexity that's there so that we can truly focus on the innovation that we want in the app or the platform or the service that we're providing.
Who's buying? Who are these customers? Like who's paying for the service, and how are you charging for it?
Awesome question. So, it's been an interesting journey over the last sort of 5 years that I've been here. And, when I first started, the customer was another fintech similar to kind of what Plaid looked like. So we were working with, and we got to start working with, a lot of these companies I just mentioned before: Robinhood, Coinbase, Chime, Venmo, Acorns, etc. When they were very small companies, like maybe a few people, a few dozen people, etc. And so we were, in a lot of cases, Plaid being a fintech, we were working with other fintechs, right? As this kind of new wave of financial app was actually coming out. But then a really big shift happened in the course of around sort of 2019, 2020, when the banks themselves actually started coming to us and saying, hey, while we've got some of the data that we need to do the things that we need to do, we actually don't have it all. And we actually need your help to go get accessibility for that data. Like, we can actually provide better products and better services because Plaid, you can help us go get other unique data out of the financial system that we can't even get ourselves, nor do we have the capacity to get it. And then we've got this kind of third wave of clients who we get to work with today, who I'd put in the kind of, they're not fintechs and they're not financial institutions, but they're kind of core technology companies. So we work with someone like Tesla, and what we help them do with that data is to make a decision about whether they would want to lend money to someone for the purchase of that vehicle, and then also to set up the recurring payments to essentially pay off that vehicle as well. So what they've actually realized is, hey, we've got a product in a vehicle, but there's also this entire service layer, this financial services layer that needs to wrap around the outside of that. And so now, again, as I said, we get to work with fintechs, financial services companies, and general technology companies who want to incorporate this data into the product experience that they're creating.
We're certainly in an age when everyone kind of wants to understand how their data has been used, and I think I know in Australia they use like My Health records, so we can kind of keep a lot more of a closer eye on all of our records and data in that respect. What is your approach, I guess, going out of the US? Because I feel like I mean, I live in Singapore. We're incredibly, as they say, innovative country with, technology at our fingertips for everything. And I would say that our banks, especially DBS, the local Singapore bank, is super tech savvy in my understanding of what banks are like. So what does that mean for kind of going out of the US?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. And look, so the good thing is, like, we're already outside of the US today. We've got offices in Canada, the UK, Europe. We've got a location in Amsterdam. And I think what's been interesting for us to see over like the last few years is there's continued to be a really deep appreciation, right, for accessibility of financial data, no matter where it is. And I think, what we're really focused on is like, hey, where are the places that we can best help and we can best impact accessibility to that data? And I think what we've seen kind of unfold over like the last sort of 5 or so years is there's a lot of different approaches to this globally. The US, as it typically does, take a fairly free market approach to this kind of stuff, which is, hey, like the industry or industries that kind of wrap around that will go off and define the way that accessibility works, and there's both challenges and opportunities that exist there. You've got places like the UK and the European Union that actually went out and kind of defined clear legislation around this stuff, saying like literally like this is a legal doctrine, this is going to be regulated, that like accessibility will be made to this data. And so what we're watching unfold, we see this in Australia now as well, as like just a real intent behind having consumers have that accessibility to that data, which is really cool. And I think, number one, I think we see innovation happening where that's been defined as important. And I think we're now getting away from the point of anyone questioning whether it's important for consumers to have that level of accessibility. The question then becomes like, how will people get access to that data? And then what also then happens from an innovation perspective. And I think, what it's been really fun and interesting to see here in the US, right? You think about like the venture capital community and things like that here, which really drives innovation, and so innovation thrives here. It spawned thousands and thousands of applications, and I think we're going to continue to see that trend kind of all across the world. Like we continue to hear from our clients all the time, like, hey, we're thinking about providing this app into Canada, into Europe. We're certainly hearing Australia. We're certainly hearing Asia Pacific a heck of a lot more, which is really great to see. And so in a lot of cases, you can follow the financial data, but you can also just follow the innovation, and like that. And that for me, I think is one of the most fun and interesting things about what I get to do every day. Is I get to see the cross section of that happening. That's my job, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a huge trend towards giving consumers access to all of the information, all of that data layer. And it seems like, when you first asked that question, it was a really good question, because you start thinking about, oh yeah, you've got the EU, they've got their own regulations, and then there's going to be other countries with their regulations. But as you start to think about it, if you're the number one provider of extracting the data and segmenting it and securing it, how much more could you possibly offer to any government regulation? If you've captured everything and giving it to them, you basically can't do any more than that, because you can't create data that doesn't exist unless you're not already extracting it. And I would say that was where your company would have a better opportunity, and it's probably why banks have never expanded beyond their own borders, because they're not agile enough to adapt to other countries' regulations.
Yeah, there's the lack of agility. Look, I think that there's also just such a massive opportunity for the banks themselves to continue to provide services, right? And like they're going to be thinking about what's also best for their own client and their own customer in the mix as well.
They're also making truckloads of money. Even during the last few years, like I'm not saying banks not making money.
Yeah, look,
they're still getting record profits.
Again, it's a system designed well for those outcomes, right? But I think what's when we think about our role in all of that as well, we stand at a really interesting intersection of all this stuff, and again, places where there's low regulation to extremely high regulation and everything in between. I think, Dave, you asked a question of like, hey, like what else can you do for those guys? I think what we've also started to realize now is that there's not just one source anymore of financial data. And this has actually been one of the big kind of paradigm shifts that have happened in like the last couple of years, is with the growth and explosion in the number of financial apps that are actually out there. There's a new superset of financial data that doesn't come from the traditional financial institution, but it's still massively important for the financial system, and it's massively important for the consumer, right? Because like if you think now about building someone's financial picture, how would you do that before? You would do that from the traditional bank that they were with, and maybe the stock and the securities that they held at that traditional bank. But you can't do that anymore, right? When you think about understanding someone's total financial picture, and I'll talk about my own, right? I bank with Wells Fargo. I've got a stock trading app in Robinhood, E-Trade, Charles Schwab. I've got my 401k with someone else as well. I've got a investing app called Acorns that I kind of do roundup savings in. I've got a roundup savings app for both of my daughters today as well. And so when you think about trying to build the financial picture for myself, so like these other apps, so that my data that sits inside Robinhood, my data that sits inside Coinbase, my data that sits inside Acorns, all of that now is also part of my financial picture. And so one of the things that we also now focus on is accessibility of all of that incremental financial data that's actually important to the financial system as well, and it not being about a one-way pull just from the banks, but it's how do we create an entire financial ecosystem of that data, and that's a really big part of like what our role now is to play at Plaid.
Yes, naturally. And so what's next? What's actually no? Tell me this instead. I don't want to know what next. That's coming later on. What's your biggest challenge?
Oh,
Apart from trying to explain to people your accent, because mate, I'm gonna tell you, you've been out of Perth too long, and it's confusing.
it's changed a bit. It's morphed a lot. I'll say that. My wife constantly tells me that I need to sound more Australian, which I actually don't really know what that means anymore. But I'll keep trying.
Think you just got to not think about what you're saying.
Everyone in Singapore thinks I sound British because they think all
You're
Australians
educated?
sound bogan. Because I'm what?
Because you're educated. Yeah.
You can't publish
well,
that.
Oh, we definitely can. We've all got so far only because of our accent.
Yeah.
That it's a uniqueness that somehow brand Australia. People think we're smart. When are they going to catch on to the fact that we have no idea what we're
We
doing?
should be talking about it now. People might actually start to catch on.
We'll definitely have to edit this part, because if everyone finds out Australians aren't that smart, what's the point? This is the career limiting thing for all Australians all around right now. They're going to hear this and go, oh my God, that's it. I can't believe we've employed these Australians. They're complete lunatics. So you're growing, you're hiring, you're in an exciting fintech disruptive space. Are you excited about what happens next?
Yeah, look, I think again we touched on
No.
I think one of the cool things is like we just sit at this intersection, right, of technology here, and what happens by sitting at the intersection of that stuff is that you just continue to see new companies thinking about solving problems in different ways all the time, and it's honestly it's what keeps me so interested and in love with like what I get to do every day, because I get to sort of swat into these companies for a little period of time and learn about the very specific problem that they're trying to solve and how they're thinking about solving it. And sometimes, look, whether we're the right company to help them solve part of that problem or not, like sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't, and that's totally fine when we're not. But like we get to see this kind of like intersection of technology and innovation all day long. And that part, like despite all the challenges and the things that go on with leading a company, like it's so much fun, and you literally wake up looking forward to what you get to work on every day, and honestly I wouldn't have it any other way.
Never thought of that. That is such a cool such a cool thing to do, because you're working with disruptive technologies that are providing new services that improve customer experience, whether it's car brands or it's investment and things like that. And that I never thought about. You provide a service, but you also get an opportunity to meet the people providing the service, and then you get insight into like what they're doing,
and
how they're doing it, why they're doing it.
How like what have they attempted so far, and what worked and what didn't work, and in a lot of cases like, hey, like you probably tried all these other things and maybe those things didn't work, and now you think that like we could potentially be a solve or a solution for that. And so we get this insight into these companies all the time, and again you get to just meet people who are thinking about the most unique ways to solve problems every day, and it's cool because that also then pushes you, right, to like think differently about solving problems and all that kind of stuff, and you get to kind of not just bear witness to it, but you then get to apply it in the things that you do every day, and like that's cool.
Paul, absolutely brilliant to have you on the podcast. It's been a long time since we've caught up physically. I'd love to see you soon. Ellie, congratulations on your first podcast.
Woohoo!
But
We should have a
before we
clapping
go,
emoji
Paul,
here.
clapping emoji, gold star for you.
Thank you.
Before we go, Paul, you got to answer this question. AI will ...
Oh, good question. AI will help drive forward financial innovation.
Oh, very
Yeah.
good.
That's very good.
Very good. And deep in thought. And I like how you brought it back to your industry. Very sensible of you. Great to catch up, mate. Thanks for being on, and look forward to catching up in San Francisco sometime
Thanks,
soon.
Ando. Ellie, thanks for the time, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Nice to meet you.